said, we decided to call this wild cultivation because a lot of people don't realize just the extent of the care and tending that people have had for plants and animals in this region for thousands of years. And I've come to sort of talk about it as cultivation. It's not the same as the gardening, Mr. McGregor's style of gardening, of annual plants planted in rows every year. But it's a way of looking after the plants and the animals like clams and others, but in encouraging their growth, their productivity, and the quality through a variety of means. And that's what I want to talk about today with Lou and with all of you. I also would like to acknowledge the First Nations of British Columbia and beyond, with deep appreciation for your care of the lands and waters of this place over countless generations, and especially with respect and thanks to the Tla'ahu's, Homalco, Wiwaikai, and Kuyaka First Nations, whose homelands are in the vicinity of where Lucretia and Lee are, and to the Snuneymuxw First Nation, within whose ancestral traditional territory I am living here on Protection Island. And many thanks to you, Lou, and to Lee, and all of you with interests in gardening and sustainable food production. Have many friends and colleagues. Some of you are here today with me, and it's pretty hard. I could spend a lot of time just talking about all of these wonderful people that I have the privilege of working with. My husband, Bob, has been my personal photographer and much more, as I like to say. And I've had a lot of support over the years for my research from different granting agencies from the University of Victoria. I'm now retired, but still have an emeritus position with the university. I especially want to acknowledge the people who've been my teachers and the knowledge holders, friends over now for over 50 years since I've started working in this area of ethnobotany and ethnoecology. And these are just a few. I'll be mentioning some of them more by name as we go, but just want to recognize some of these folks. This is Sam Mitchell from Hatlip, and he's got a digging stick that he gave to me that I still have. It's made out of a mule deer antler, a wonderful implement for the kind of cultivation that people do. Kwa'ksistalawatla Clan Chief Adam Dick of the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation at Sawadena passed away in 2018. Selena Tamoyakan from the Okanagan Nation, Dr. Mary Thomas from the Secwixw Nation, Dr. Margaret Sywallis from the Nuxalk Nation, and coming down to the lower right-hand corner, Annie York from Spasm and Nlaka'pamux Nation, my friend Chief Ron Ignace from Skeetchistan in the Secwixw Nation, Elsie Claxton from Tsilhqot'in, Dr. Umik Richard Atleo, who lives up in Chilliwack, but is from a Hausut First Nation, New Channel, Chief Ernie Hill from the Kitkat Nation in Hartley Bay, and Ida Jones from the Dididat Nation. Many of these people have passed away now, but I still think of them as being with me. And I think of them very often. I can see their faces, I can hear their voices as I'm out and about. And it always gives me great pleasure to think about them and all that they've taught me. I just wanted to make a special tribute to Kwa'ksistalawatla, Clan Chief Adam Dick. As I mentioned, he passed away in 2018, but he was a wonderful teacher. And he was the one who provided the Kwakwala word that means keeping it living, that turned out to be the title of a book that my friend Doug Doerr and I edited. So that the keeping it living is actually a Kwakwala word that pertains to this idea of wild cultivation, because almost all of the plants that people used here and cultivated are perennials. And so, in many cases, the strategy for using them was to use their reproductive and regenerative capacity to keep them living while you still use them. It's easy to do with berry picking, but you can also do it with greens and with bark and branches and other parts of plants as well. So this afternoon, just after a introduction, tell you three quick stories that kind of got me on this path of learning about wild cultivation. And then talk about Indigenous environmental knowledge systems and how those relate to traditional land and resource management. Give you a few examples and then sort of talk about what this all means. So just a bit of background. In Northwestern North America, and I'm thinking about the area from about central Alaska, south to the Columbia River and east to the Rockies, that area, there are about people, Indigenous people speaking 50 different major languages and major dialects in this area. So you can imagine the diversity that there is just represented and reflected in those languages. And over, they've used over hundreds of different plant and animal species, fish and seafood, shellfish and so forth, sea mammals and land mammals, geese and other birds, and then a whole range of plant foods, um, and woods and fibers and medicinal plants and so forth. And of course, there are many stories and ceremonies and traditions that relate to the use of these plants and animals. And there's also a strong evidence reflected in the names and the stories and commonalities of knowledge across First Nations groups, that indicate a lot of sharing over generations, over thousands of years, in information about what's edible and what's not, different techniques like pit cooking, and so forth. People have been living in this area for at least 14,000 years. That seems to be um, the earliest time now, but the time that people have lived here, is what Adam would say, since the beginning of time. It goes back so far that for people here, they've always been here, and yeah, it um, there's just such a long tradition of people living in this area and using the resources sustainably over that period of time. People along the coast have relied on marine resources a lot. They've obviously been resilient and resourceful, always incorporating new ideas and technologies. And I have to stress this, are as vibrant and knowledgeable and active today as ever before. And I've had the privilege of learning and participating from people for, as I mentioned, for over 50 years in this area. Here are two maps drawn by my friend Dr. Nancy Mack, and one shows those 50 language groups, just on the map here, and the other shows the comparable environmental diversity that we have. So the major ecosystems, but within each one of those major vegetation zones are dozens of different subzones and habitats based on topography and moisture and so forth. So if you superimpose this cultural diversity as reflected in the languages with the ecological diversity, you get this really rich biocultural diversity of this region. And as I mentioned, The populations of people were very dense in some places, and although they're often called hunter-gatherers, I don't prefer to use that term because it implies that people just went out and randomly picked and plucked things, which was far from what reality was. They had tremendously deep knowledge about using resources and sustaining them over time. A lot of the early accounts tended to ignore plant use altogether, and people talk about the Northwest Coast as being people were fishers mainly and hunters secondarily, and some of the early accounts don't mention plants at all, which is hardly fair. So going back to the stories that I mentioned, one is with Clan Chief Adam Dick, and he was talking about an area of the estuary of the Kingcome River in the Ts'msyen territory, where he spent a lot of his childhood and adulthood as well. But as a child, he would go with his mother and grandmother down to the estuary, the tidal marshes at the mouth of the river, where they had their tequila root gardens. Tequila in Kwakwala means place of manufactured soil. And that was the place where they cultivated a series of root vegetables, including one called tachsus, the springbank clover, dliksam, which is Pacific silverweed, quinny, which is Nootka lupin, and huquam, which is the rice root, Fritillaria kamchatensis, named after the Kamchatka Peninsula in Asia, where it also grows. So he said, he was talking about these roots and said it was all important, and he named them. And here they are, the Nootka lupin, the quinny, here's the dliksam, and here's the huquam, and here's the tachsus. And here they are being prepared for pit cooking, being bundled and put into thimbleberry leaves to be cooked in an underground pit. And he recalled, yes, that was my job. And he talked about the huquam, to pick them off. He talked about this something called the gagump, which means grandfather, on the bottom of the huquam rice root bulb. Then they told me to throw it back into the garden. It's like a cup, and that huquam sits in there. That was my job as a kid when I was with the old people. I thought, what is that? I have no idea. It took me a long time until we went up there, and Adam was able to show me what the gagump looked like. It's a sprout that comes from the bottom of the rice root, as well as the little rice-like grains around the bulb. There's a bigger sprout on the bigger roots, and that's what he was talking about. So I said, so Adam, is that gagump going to grow into a new plant? And he said, yes, that's why we did it. He didn't say it like that, of course. He was very kind, but it was sort of like, you dummy, it's so obvious. You didn't need to ask. But I wanted to make sure that I was understanding what he was doing. So then, the very same year, I was up in the interior with Dr. Mary Thomas, the Shuswap Nation. And she started talking about how she would go with her grandmother and her mother up to the subalpine meadows around the Nisga'a area and dig the sxwixw, the rice, the yellow glacier lily or avalanche lily, it's called. And she said, yeah, we would help grandma. She would dig and turn the sod over with a digging stick. We'd be right there looking through, and we only took the big ones. We buried back the little ones. And then when you look at the root, when you get it, there's a little right on the end, looks like it's got little whiskers, the root. You had to clip that off and throw it back in the soil where it was growing so it would go back again. And you can see down in the lower corner, it shows the sxwixw, the glacier lily bulb with a little corm attached to the side. And that's what she was talking about. They call it the whiskers. She said they take it down to the camp and clean the bulbs, and they make a little pile of the whiskers, and then they take them back up to the place where they dug them and replant them again. Thought, wow, that's amazing. Two elders speaking different languages from different areas, one down by the ocean, one up in the mountains, talking about the same kind of thing. That's amazing. And then a few years later, I was talking with my friend Cyril Carpenter from the Heiltsuk Nation, and we were out on his boat, and he was talking about his grandmother telling him there was a place up at Roscoe Inlet, which is in Heiltsuk territory, um, where his grandmother pointed out to him when they were going by in a boat. She said, "That's where we had our berry gardens." And she said they would have a place beside a waterfall. So there's lots of water on a south facing slope. So there's lots of sunlight. And they'd bring their berry bushes, their blueberries and other berries, and plant them there beside the waterfall. And they'd bury fish guts and other remains from their camps, clam shells and fire ash and so forth, around the roots of these berry bushes. And my friend Pauline Waterfall, her grandmother and Cyril's grandmother were related to each other, and her grandmother told her the same thing. And she said you could just pull the berries off by the handful. Well, that was the first I'd heard of something like that, these berry gardens. So I put that together. Some years later, um, Cyril passed away some years ago, very sadly, but his wife, Jennifer, is a very good friend. And Jennifer and I and a bunch of people went up to Roscoe Inlet. Some of you know Harvey Humchit and Brenda Humchit. We all went up there with the kids and we looked and we think we found where the berry garden was. But I think it would be about 80 years ago and the trees had grown up a lot. So we couldn't tell for sure. But it was really interesting to see that. So those three stories go together to kind of show you how my thinking has come around to understanding more of how people were actually tending the plants that they used and weren't just randomly picking and plucking them as they went. So we go back to what is this system of knowledge that it's parallel to and in many ways very similar to Western scientific knowledge, but it has its differences as well. And my friend Fikret Burkus, his book Sacred Ecology is now in its fourth edition, but it gave this definition: a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. And here we have my favorite photo of cultural transmission going on with my friend Helen Clifton, who I already mentioned maybe earlier. She's in the community at Hartley Bay, the Gitgat community. She's 96 years old now. This was taken some years ago down at the Kiel Seaweed Camp. And there she is pounding dried halibut walks, the dried strips of halibut with her yew-wood mallet, and her little granddaughter Janelle, who's now all grown up, has got her little mallet and she's pounding walks with her grandma. And they're just having fun together. And Janelle probably doesn't even know that she's learning all of this information about how to harvest food and how to process it and look after it. And she will never forget that for her whole life. So these are some of the aspects that are embodied in this Indigenous knowledge systems. All the practical knowledge about what is good to eat, how you process it, where you go to get it, how you harvest it, and all of that. About the birds and the tides and the sun and the weather, seasonal rounds, all of that is very important part of the knowledge, but it's not the only thing. The way the knowledge is passed on, as I just explained, or through stories or through ceremony, participatory learning, and so forth, communication, that's important. The way the way planning and governance of resources takes place is part of it as well. And of course, the underlying worldview, the way that people regard the resources and their lands with tremendous respect and gratitude and a feeling of also responsibility, that's part of the knowledge system as well. Here's my friend Umik, Dr. Richard Atleo, at the Atleo River in a house at Territory. And this is, he has the hereditary responsibility to look after the Atleo River watershed. That's what a chief does. A chief has these responsibilities to care for their people and for the lands and resources under their stewardship. So food production is an important part of traditional land and resource management. As I will just go into a little bit more. And how did people learn about all these things that they know? Well, they've been keen observers for millennia, and animals are great teachers. Plants are as well. But here you can see where grizzly bear has dug up that Tsilhqot'in, uh, the rice root, and scattered some of the little rice-like bulblets around. And you can tell after a few years that the grizzly's digging and disturbance of the soil actually helps to propagate the rice root. So people would practice that in their own gardening. And then you see where black bear has eaten the huckleberries from a bush and scattered the berries around. And people will go to an area now when they pick berries, and as a ceremonial aspect of picking, they'll pick the first handful of berries and throw them over their shoulder to a place where there's no berry bushes growing to ensure that the berries are distributed and disseminated further. So those are just two ways that people might learn from the animals. And even learning from the beaver, how when you cut back, when you coppice a willow or a Saskatoon bush or some other bush, the, the plant will compensate by sprouting up uh, around the cut. And you get many, multiple long, straight withes to start with that are great for making baskets or for fishing weirs and things like that. So, and also a lot of the knowledge about cultivation, if we can call it that, is known to women. And in the past, most of the people who documented cultural information from outside an area were men. They were male anthropologists, they were people, governors, they were people living in the area, and they're the ones who wrote about Indigenous cultures in the area. And they often didn't have a chance to talk to women or observe women's work, and they totally overlooked it in many cases. And so a lot of the knowledge that I'm talking about comes directly from the women about how to harvest basket materials, how to harvest root vegetables and berry picking and so forth. And yes, men learned it, especially when they were young and they were out with their mothers and grandmothers. But there was often a division of labor where the men were the ones who did the hunting and fishing. Not always. It wasn't required, but that tended to be a complementary projects that men and women had, and children would participate wherever it worked out for them, and they learned as they went. You can see this little girl here with her mom up in Botany Valley in the Nlaka'pamux country, learning about root digging with her mom. And as I mentioned, this knowledge is embedded with beliefs and practices. And Some of you know my book called The Earth's Blanket, and this is the quotation that that book, the title comes from. It's from the unpublished notes of ethnographer James Tate. Plants, flowers, plants, and grass, especially the latter, are the covering or blanket of the earth. If too much plucked or ruthlessly destroyed, earth is sorry, it weeps, it rains, or is angry and makes rain, fog, and bad weather. Well, that is a lesson in itself. You only take what you need. You don't take more than you need. You hear that all the time from the teachers. They're taught that as children. You never waste and you never take too much, or there will be consequences. And there are all kinds of stories that hint at people's activities. For example, this story recorded by Thomas McElraith about Raven bringing soapberries to the Bella Coola Valley, how he carried the soapberry whip from a mountain who was a chief hosting a feast up in the interior. And Raven stole some of the whip of the soapberries that were being served and flew with it down into the Bella Coola Valley. And as he went over the crest down into the valley, he was so excited. He had to call, and of course, the soapberry whip fell out of his beak and fell all over the head of the valley, and wherever it landed, soapberries grew. And he never made it back to Bella Coola with the soapberries, so there are none growing down there. But you have to go up to the head of the valley. And this is a story that talks about plant distribution. It helps people understand where you find particular plants and a lot of other things as well. Um, but it also may hint at humans' role in transporting plants around. That's a project that I've been working on lately, looking at the way that people translocated plants from one area to another. And of course, there are many stories that reflect and words, vocabulary that reflect these different management methods, like the word that I mentioned that translates as keeping it living in Kwakwala. So here are some of the ways that people looked after their plants. And as I say, all of these are embedded in stories and language and education, in ceremony and so forth. Selective or partial harvesting from trees, living trees and shrubs, tilling the soil, disturbing and tilling the soil, weeding, sometimes with the tequila root gardens, especially. Passive fertilizing, like the tidal marsh gardens get fertilized with the highest tides every year, bringing detritus into the garden. But also active fertilizing with the berry gardens, digging fish guts around the berry bushes. Pruning and coppicing, planting and replanting that I've talked about, transplanting, use of fire, sorry, clearing land, creating special terraces like with the clam gardens, but also sometimes with root gardens, and overall proprietorship or ownership of areas, as with the Atleo River Valley. It's not ownership in the European sense, but rather the responsibility that people had over the lands and resources under their care. So partial harvesting, Mary Thomas describes how she would harvest birch bark for her baskets. You have to be very careful that you don't cut through that thin pulp that covers the tree, or the sap will start to come out and you deprive the tree of sap. Once the bark is taken off, it will turn into a hard surface and that protects the tree. The juice will still go up and make leaves and it keeps the tree alive. So if you harvest birch bark or cherry bark carefully and properly, you don't kill the tree. the tree will regenerate a layer around the bark, and it will continue to live and grow. I talked about Richard and the Atleo River Valley. So throughout people's territories, there were prime resource areas that were named and owned in the way that I mentioned, managed and celebrated as special places. And the ownership and responsibility for these places was transferred from one generation to another. Patches of berries, fishing areas, cedar bark harvesting areas. All of these, they had some. They weren't just kind of open in the broad sense that anybody could go there without permission. And with, as I say, management goes hand in hand with resource use. So knowing about the resources and how they regenerate themselves, how you can take a piece from a cedar tree at the bottom and the tree will continue to live. All of these are part of the knowledge system. So we have all up and down the coast thousands of what are called culturally modified trees. Trees like cedar or alder, crabapple, birch that have had parts of them removed and they're still living, sometimes hundreds of years after the original part was removed from them. And this is just one example from Edward Curtis's writings from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. A standing tree from which boards have been split is called begged from, and it is said that since trees are believed to have a sentient life, before obtaining boards, they would ask the tree, beg for a piece of the tree. Please, we hope you'll let us have a piece of you. And if they were taking a branch or a piece of a yew tree, they would the same thing. A very different kind of approach to taking resources from what the most of the predominant resource harvesting systems are here in British Columbia. And here are some examples of Western red cedar that have had pieces of bark. This is a recent one taken, a strip of bark going up from the cedar tree for basketry. Here's one from the Gitga'at Nation that is probably 100 years old. And here, this big old tree had had pieces of bark taken from it over centuries. Sometimes several pieces of bark taken at different times, used for roofing or baskets or trays and um, other purposes. So examples include the production of the root vegetables. I've already talked about that a little bit. People burned over root growing areas like up in the mountains or the Camas prairies around southeastern Vancouver Island. Plots were owned by families or individuals. Often the digging was done at a time when the seeds were ripe, so they would be bumped and knocked into the soil at the same time that the roots were being dug. Of course, there's selective harvesting. You take the big ones and leave the little ones behind. Transplanting and replanting. Ceremonial harvesting. So the first root ceremony, which recognizes the value of these roots. And as well, people traded and exchanged from areas where the roots were common to areas where they weren't. And there are always stories and teachings about these, like the star husband tales from the Saanich Nation, where women married stars and went up and dug Camas bulbs in the sky. I wish I had time to share all of these stories with you, but they're some really beautiful stories that go with almost all of these plants. So with Camas, for example, a very important root vegetable whose main carbohydrate is inulin, which has to be converted to fructose to make the bulbs more digestible. But that's done with the pit cooking method that people have used for generations, hundreds of years. We figured, based on Chris Paul's from Tsartlip his accounts of families harvesting a 200-pound gunny sack of Camas bulbs a year for one family. We figured multiplying out the number of families with the number of communities harvesting, that people were harvesting about 10 million Camas bulbs a year from southeastern Vancouver Island. And yet, the places where you want to find Camas, you go to the places where people were digging, and you'll find the best Camas patches even today. And these were maintained by burning after the harvest and so forth. And the patches were owned, as Wayne Suttles recounts from one of the people who taught him from the Tsilhqot'in Nation. They didn't dig just anywhere. Stakes marked them. Women owned them. They would fight for their claims. If someone came on a woman's plot, she would quarrel, and then the plot would be inherited if a woman passed away. My friend Dr. Brenda Beckwith did her PhD work on Camas production. And after doing some sort of simulated cultivation, following these practices of weeding and separating and so forth, here are the kinds of bulbs that she produced from Camas that she'd salvaged from highway construction sites. And our student Kate Proctor did her master's work on the Camas harvesting areas at the Garryoak, Somenos Garryoak Preserve at Duncan. And these are all the bulbs that she removed from 1 square meter of ground under the Garryoaks in a Camas meadow. And you can see we separated them out by age. So the smallest little teardrop ones are at the top, and they're in the top 2 centimeters of soil, and then 2-year-old, and then 3-year-old. By 4 years old, the bulbs are getting bigger and they're pushing down into the soil until by the time they're 6 or 7 years old, the bulbs are maybe 10, 20 centimeters deep in the soil. So when you're digging, you dig around an area with a digging stick all the way around, and then you pry up the turf over that area and flip it over. You can easily reach down and pick out the big bulbs and thin out the patch and leave them with maybe doing a bit of judicious weeding of grasses and letting the seeds also be dispersed into the soil. Then you flip it back and you might give a light burn over the area, which provides a shot of nutrients for the plants. And you come back in about 3 years, you'd have a whole new crop of Camas bulbs ready to dig. It was like a perpetual harvest system over generations. And the digging stick, the perfect tool. Oh, I wish I had mine here to show you, but they're usually made of yew wood, sometimes of ocean spray, which is a very hard wood, ocean spray spirea, which is called digging stick plant in some languages. And here's the mule deer antler digging stick that Sam Mitchell was using. Here's a yew, one made of black hawthorn that belonged to Mary Thomas that she gave me. So there are many different styles, but they're all very efficient ways of digging these root vegetables. You don't cut them in half like you would with a shovel. These digging sticks are also used for clams. So there they are. Sorry, we'll go back if I can. Again, to Adam's words about these root vegetables, when they go down to the flats, they use little pegs. You got your own pegs in the flats. That was my area. That's your area. Digging in the soft ground so it'll grow better every year. Well, I guess fertilizing, cultivating, I guess that's the word for it. Every family had pegs, owned their little plots in the flats. And there you can see how the little bulblets will regenerate if you plant them out. So when you're separating the bulbs and digging them, you're going to leave some behind. You'll always have some growing for the next year. And here's a sketch of a root garden from Franz Boas and George Hunt in the Nimkish river tidal flats. And these were all tequila root gardens that were owned by individual families with rockwork enclosures. And that's a really tremendous way of perennial food production. Again, Curtis writes, cloverland is very valuable because the roots are regarded as indispensable to good health and hence can readily be sold at a high price. For this reason, the land is well cared for. And the roots were transplanted too. When I was up in the Kitlope Valley in the early 1990s, I met the the son of Margaret Sywallis's cousin, who told him that Margaret and her husband Stephen came up to the Kitlope Valley, used to come up by dugout canoe from Bella Coola and the Kitlope, the Kimsquit area, and around in the early 1920s, and they brought the taxus with them and planted them there, and we went and found them growing in a little patch in the river edge tidal area. Wapato is another example of a root vegetable that was cultivated, the transplanted tubers, and people would clear other growth so that the Wapato tubers would grow more easily. And look what they found a few years back now, in the about 2010 or so. They found a 3,800-year-old tended Wapato patch. And they call it Hulkoltz in Hulkametum, and or Hulkamelam, the upriver Hulkamelam language. And it was pure Wapato, and they were able to age these tubers that were waterlogged, and so they were preserved, mixed in with the tips of digging sticks. Isn't that amazing? There's been lots written about that. And one time when I visited Hatlip up near Lillooet, there'd been a fire go through the year before. I could find these wild onions that were about a meter tall. They were just enormous, and that was from the after a fire. So it shows what burning can do as a form of maintaining habitat for these root vegetables. Baptist Ritchie from Mount Currie told a story called Burning Mountainsides for Better Crops, and talked about how they used to burn over the subalpine meadows, and the mountain potatoes, Claytonia, were as big as walnuts. Now they're just tiny because they're not cultivated anymore, he said. The same with the tiger lily, he said they were as big as tennis balls. And the Tsilhqot'in people had a practice of sending women up to the high country, the potato mountains, when they'd lost their husband and were mourning and unable to get over their bereavement. They were told to go up into the mountains and pull up the old stalks of the mountain potato and throw them to places where they weren't growing. And we found some up there when we were there, and I put them in an envelope, these old stalks. Forgot about them for a couple of weeks, and when I opened the envelope, sure enough, there were these tiny little black seeds there. They'd ripened from the fleshy stems of the mountain potato, and sure enough, they grew into new mountain potato plants. And so the Tsilhqot'in people say, yes, we were responsible for the potatoes on Potato Mountain. And sure enough, it looks like numerous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, just like the daffodils of Tennyson back in England, if it was Tennyson. Anyways, it's just beautiful up there, and it is amazing. And they say they're responsible for that. And then just quickly, because we're running out of time a little bit, as usual, but I just wanted to mention berry production. I already talked about the berry gardens a little bit, But many types of berries are known to grow very well after a fire. And I've seen this myself. If you go into an area that has had a burn a few years back, the huckleberries, the blueberries, the blackcaps, even the strawberries are just flourishing. And that's what Baptist Ritchie talked about in his story, Burning Mountainsides for Better Crops as well. So all of these fruits were managed in various ways. Um, and the crab apples, for example, were pruned back, and groves of crab apples were owned and tended by different people who had the proprietorship for them. Burning, coppicing, and pruning were some of the management methods. So these are the plants that were really improved by fire, periodic fire, not the intensive wildfires that we get nowadays because the forests have become too grown over and they burn too hot now. Since fire, these kinds of tending fires were banned back in the early 1900s, about the same time that Smokey the Bear was born, people haven't been able to burn. And so the land's gotten much bushier, and a lot of these berries and the root vegetables have diminished in quality and quantity, the elders say, since that time. They would burn every 5 or 6 years. Now it's only timber grows, Sam Mitchell said, takes away from the other. They burned at Lillooet to make the raspberries and west of Lillooet for the huckleberries. And Annie York, lots of huckleberries. They wait until close to fall. They know just when to burn. Then 2 or 3 years after, lots of huckleberries. I can hear her say that. Lots of blueberries and the scammach. That's the same as sxwixw. That's when it grows. When you burn, I've seen it when the old people used to do it. I was just a little girl. I'd go up to the mountain with Granny. After we'd pick berries, my uncle would say, it's going to rain pretty soon. Time to burn. So he says he stays up after we're finished, and then we go back the next year. It's all burned. I actually wrote a book chapter called Time to Burn after that quotation that's in a book edited by Robert Boyd that's coming out into a new edition this year. It was first published in 1999. And pruning. Here's Adam Dick. As soon as they pick all the berries, we weed it. We break it. We break it so that the berries would grow. See, a lot of people think we never touched the wild berries, but we did. We cultivated it. We pruned it, especially that guadams, the red huckleberries. When you finished picking the guadams, they pruned them. Same with the salmon berries, he would say. Everybody had their own patches, berry patches, just like everyone had their own clam beds. Things like salal, yeah, salmon berries, all that, all kinds of berries, wild crabapple. You don't just go out and pick. There's certain places that a certain family goes. And they had the responsibility for those patches, and they would look after them, and they would monitor them, and they would be able to know when they were ready to be picked, and all of those things. Anything that's pegged, it's someone's. So all of these high bush cranberries, blueberries, hazelnuts were all pruned, coppiced, transplanted. The wood was used for basket rims and so forth, for fish weirs and arrows and all kinds of other implements. And the patches were owned. And transplanting here in the Nass Valley, Emma Nice, who is the mother of, now passed away, but the mother of Harry Nice, mother-in-law of my friend Deanna Nice, she told me how her grandmother at Gitwinsilk was blind, and her grandfather, she loved to pick berries, so her grandfather went out and transplanted all the fruit bushes around their house. They're still growing there today around their house at Gitwinsilk, the Saskatoons, the black hawthorn, the crabapple, snach, they called the black hawthorn snach, and they made delicious dried cakes out of it. And some are still there. And they did these things with the animal populations as well. And we've heard a lot about the clam gardens recently. And Adam Dick was the one who really explained what the Latifolia were. My friend John Harper had noticed flying over these strange beach formations, but he didn't know what they were. And Adam Dick was the one who taught him about the Latifolia and how they created these ideal clam habitats by rolling the rocks down to the low tide line and building up the beaches and continuously harvesting the clams to ensure that the beds were well aerated and so forth, selectively harvesting the clams just the way they did the Camas bulbs. So we have these areas today where we can see the evidence of multi-resource management systems, all the way from the intertidal zone to the fishing areas, fish traps, which were not just traps, but they were ways of monitoring the salmon going up the river, to the crabapple orchards and the berry gardens and the tidal marsh root gardens, and the the culturally modified cedar stands, all of these things together in one area, as you'll find in the Heiltsuk territory of Hoyat on the north coast of North Hunter Island. And there's a wonderful website for you to look at if you haven't had a chance that talks about Hoyat. All of these different resources were cared for, intended, stinging nettles for fish nets and line, gooseberries, thimbleberries, highbush cranberries, salmonberries, wild currants, and culturally modified cedars, all in this area. And similarly, up on the Ts'msyen River in Ts'msyen territory, there's a place called Robintown that has a constellation of these different managed resources, from hazelnuts and highbush cranberry, lot tops on crabapple trees so that people could reach the upper branches, red elderberry, rice root transplanted from the coast, hazelnut, devil's club, wild ginger, all of these plants growing together in these amazing, what we call orchard gardens. So hunter-gatherers, I think they got it wrong. As my friend Daisy Seawood Smith said, they didn't believe that we did this. They think that nature just grows on its own, but our people felt to get more harvest and bigger berries. They did these things, same thing a farmer does. And sadly, the newcomers were generally blind, sometimes conveniently blind to these practices. And we have Joseph Tretch saying, oh, people made no real use of their land. And they prevent settlement and cultivation of their lands and use this to justify taking over the lands of First Nations all over British Columbia. We often talk about our right as strangers to take possession, and even Malcolm Sproat, who was more sympathetic to First Nations, especially as he got to know them better. But he said, with the exception of hunting animals, plucking wild fruits, and cutting a few trees to make canoes and houses, the natives did not in any civilized sense occupy the land. And I put this picture here on purpose because this is what a civilized occupation of the land looks like in some places. So as I mentioned at the beginning, these practices are as important today as they ever were. Some of the details have been forgotten and obscured with loss of land and access to territory and ability to practice some of these strategies, but the learning continues. There's still people who know about them. And so it means that people can relearn, can learn from others as they've done over generations for millennia. And now this is a time of restoration and renewal of some of these practices. I'm very happy to say there are all kinds of projects going on all over the place where these plants are being re-recognized and reincorporated into the diets. Renewal, restoration, and revitalization. Very similar to the permaculture practices that some of you are very familiar with. And yeah, we'll just leave it at that, that there's been a lot of respectful collaboration, and these practices have excellent potential for being reinstated everywhere. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'm sorry, I think I went on a little too long, but I'm very happy to have been able to share that with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Turner. Nancy, you did not go on too long at all. I mean, I think you know we hang on every word. It's like being read a delicious story. I just want to let some of it sink in, especially when you say these practices are as important today as they ever were. I have so much hope that we can use this knowledge in getting us out of the pickle we're in. Do you have hope like that, Dr. Turner?
Oh, absolutely, I do. I think there is this movement to what we would call ecocultural restoration and renewal. And I think we're just at the beginning of it. But I have hope for a lot of different reasons. You know, I was told when I started working 50 years ago, you you better record, when they found out that I was interested in working with Indigenous elders, you better record it all because it's all going to be gone in 10 years. Well, here it is 50, 55 years later after that. And there's still people, not only people who know this, but people who are practicing it, who are relearning it, and it goes along with language revitalization as well. And and I just see the renewal and the flourishing and the hope, and it goes along with the amazing resilience of plants and their ability to regenerate themselves from not only from seed but from cuttings and from you know they can do it naturally, and we can give them a helping hand uh, just by some of the practices that I've talked about. So yeah, I feel very hopeful, and I feel hopeful when I see all of you and what you're doing, and your interest in this kind of thing, and talk to my many teachers and to their children and their grandchildren. So yeah, Mother Nature is amazingly resilient, and that's what I think we can all place our hope in that.
Thank you. So that's something we're all hoping for as well. We have people from Victoria, Kelowna, Olympic Peninsula, Gabriola Island, Cortes Island, Quadra, Courtney, Alberta, Ontario. We have people all over the place, and they are wanting to know if you'll come back. And I'm sure hoping so too. And we also have a lot of questions and comments, so we can get into some of that. You know, we'll love seeing you whenever you have time to gab again with us, Nancy.
Well, how could I say no, Lou? I could never say no to you.
Oh, well, we haven't tested that one yet, but I think the feeling is mutual. You know, I was reflecting on when you came up to Quadra Island, Cortes Island, you actually launched our Cortes Island Garden Club for us. It was a lovely fundraiser. You helped us get started, and I was reflecting on driving around together in the car and how you would look off in the distance 20, 40, 50 feet and say, oh, there's cascara. And this was, there were no leaves on the trees. It was, I think, early November or something. And then we drive a little way more. Oh, there's wild cherry. And I was like, how are you identifying all of these? And you said to me, because they're my old friends.
Yeah, they are. It's the same way that all of us, we have our friends, we can identify our friends' faces pretty easily. Even with masks on, we can see their eyes and identify them. So it's the same with plants. When they're your friends, you get to recognize them. You know where you're going to find them. You look out for them, and there they are. And it always gives you a real jolt of pleasure to see them.
So true. Speaking of friends, Tom and Haley, some of your friends, wrote a note to you asking how that hazelnut tree is growing, and also asking, what can people like us who love plants do to support reconciliation? Do you have a comment?
Oh gosh.
Tom, Haley?
Yeah. Oh, the hazelnuts are growing really well. Yes.
Yay.
And to, I guess, to support reconciliation, to listen, to be willing to listen and to seek out advice, to not just consult, but to learn from people, and ask, don't be afraid to ask, what can I do? What is meaningful? What can I contribute to in some meaningful way for people? And it varies, but there's projects, there's different events that you can attend to learn more about First Nations language and culture, and almost everywhere ways that you can help and support the great efforts that are going on in restoration, revitalization, and cultural renewal. So yeah, just keep your eyes and ears open. Be open to talking to people. Not talking too much. I can hear some of my elder friends saying, "Oh, you ask too many questions." Sometimes just listen. Daisy
Wow.
Seward Smith would say, she learned when she was a kid, okay, you use these and these before you use this. And so
Oh,
that's a
that's
good lesson for a lot of us.
always and forever, learning to listen and observe. We're being asked, are we recording this session? Yes, we are recording, and it will be posted on our Gabbing About Gardening Facebook page. Brian Hayden, your old friend Brian.
Oh, hi, Brian.
Is there one of your publications presents all this together? Can we get this as a smorgasbord book, Nancy?
Hi, Brian. I can send you a paper that covers the I've written and co-authored a number of pieces on cultivation in various ways, but my 2-volume book, although it's way too big and everything, but I do have a series of chapters in there that might be of interest to some people, called Ancient Pathways, Ancestral Knowledge, published by McGill Queen's Press. And
I'll post a link to that, Nancy, so that people can check that out as well.
okay, and some of you might also, oh yes,
I love this book. You mentioned it today. I mean, I think I have as many. I mean, this, of course, the food plants of coastal First Peoples. Anybody who goes outside in British Columbia or along the coast wants to take that book with them. Your books are just gold and continue to be such valuable tools to learning. We have a question from Marie for you, Nancy. Oh no, actually a comment that this material needs to be integrated into early learning curriculums. Bravo, I agree wholeheartedly. And I know you do a lot of teaching in schools and people are very receptive. A question from Lonnie Taylor, is wild cherry edible?
Oh, good question, Lonnie. Yes, it is, but it's the wild cherry that we have here on the coast mostly is the bitter cherry, and it's aptly named. It is quite bitter, and don't eat the seeds because they have like the seeds of almonds and apple and peach and so forth. Not all well, the sweet almond, the bitter almond, peach stones and apricots have um, cyanogenic glycosides. They're compounds that release cyanide if you bruise them or chew them up. So they can actually be quite poisonous. So don't eat cherry seeds, but you can eat the flesh around the bitter cherry, even though it's hard to get a good meal from because they're so tiny. Up in the interior, of course, we have the pin cherry, which is closely related and has a much sweeter, fleshier cherry that is edible. And then the choke cherry is the third prunus that we have. And the choke cherries are delicious, make delicious jelly. You can make fruit leather and things from them, but again, don't eat the seeds of the choke cherries.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. The wild cherry is bitter, the pin cherry is bitter. Don't eat the seeds, and choke cherry is your best bet.
Yeah,
Like.
pin cherry's good. It's not bitter.
Pin cherry's
Pin
good,
cherry's
great.
sweet up in the interior. Yeah.
Good thing we're recording this so I can go back and refresh. Lee Gass had a comment. Lee, are you still with us?
I
I'm
see
right
him.
here.
Hi, Lee.
Hi there. Hey, your storytelling. I got a comment on a big part of your message, which is storytelling is a very rich and powerful and potent way of communicating personal and cultural knowledge. And you embody that
Oh, thank you,
in the
Lee.
way you tell stories.
Thank you very much.
Thank
That's
you.
a
That
real
is
compliment. Thank you.
And it's very true. We're all just hanging on every word. Hank is asking you a question, Nancy. How is rice root processed? Actually, it's from Tanya. How is rice root processed?
Oh, good question, Tanya. So it's not the main carbohydrate in the rice root is starch, not inulin. So it doesn't actually have to be pit cooked for like the prolonged cooking that goes with Camas bulbs to convert the inulin into fructose. It's not so necessary. You can actually process or cook the rice root just by steaming it and it doesn't take long until it's just soft and you can just eat it. Usually, my elder friends prefer it with a dressing of ulican grease or seal oil or something like that. But you can eat it on its own with butter and salt, or just there are many different ways that you can eat rice root. You can cook it in a cooking pit, especially one that you're just cooking for an hour and a half or so. And it's really good if you wrap it in thimbleberry leaves the way I showed it in the photo. We did a pit cook up when we went with Quaxistala up to the Kingcome Inlet to the village, Guai village there, and did a pit cook with the community using these root vegetables and with some of the kids, teaching some of the kids how to do pit cooking, which was really fun. So, but the rice root, you can just steam it in a steamer or boil it for a short time. And I showed a picture of Chief Ernie Hill, who's passed away now, but he lived at Hartley Bay and he loved rice root. In fact, when I first heard about the opportunity to work at Hartley Bay, I'd heard already that they still ate rice root in that community. And I was so excited to think here was a community where people actually still went out to dig rice root and ate it. And when I got there, I found indeed it was Ernie Hill and his family who were still harvesting rice root, and I hope they still are to this day. But
Oh, I do too.
I learned a lot about rice root from my Haida friends as well. It's called intling, which means tooth, or
Mm.
Tsilhqot'in and Masset Haida. That means a round thing you dig out with your finger. You can actually dig it with your finger because it's usually not too deep down. And as I said, grizzly bears and other animals like to eat it as well. It's an amazing, beautiful plant.
Wow, it sounds amazing and gourmet. I'm sure a lot of these foods take a retraining of taste buds because we're so hooked on sugar and salt in our edible cultures.
Yeah, the rice root has a slight bitter taste to it, I have to warn you. But bitter is a flavor that, as you say, we've kind of grown away from. And yet, some of our favorite foods have a bitter quality. We think about coffee, that a lot of us enjoy in the morning, as a slight bitterness to it. And beer, for those of you who like to drink beer, has a slight bitterness to it. So we do have, there, you can get used to that flavor. It's also found in soapberry whip, which some of you might have tried, and it has a slight bitter taste. And people put a bit of sugar with it nowadays, but you don't need to put too much. And after a while, you get to kind of enjoy that bitter flavor. And my friend Harriet Kuhnlein worked in the with the New Hulk Food and Nutrition Program, and they did what were called the grandmother, mother, daughter interviews. And they talked with women in these 3 generations about their food preferences. And indeed, the grandmothers loved the rice root, huquam. And the mother generation, they kind of liked it. The granddaughters didn't like it. It was too bitter for them. But it shows that we tend to like the foods that we're raised with. And if you're raised with very sweet foods with lots of sugar, then you like those foods.
Exactly. You have to wean yourself off. We have a question from Joyce McMenamin. Sorry, Joyce. I always mess up that beautiful name. And she is asking about eelgrass, how it's used, and is it managed? Is it a managed resource?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, Joyce, because Kwa'ksi and Daisy Seward Smith were the ones who taught us about Ts'msyen, which is the Kwakwala word for eelgrass. And they used to eat the rhizomes long ago, and some people still eat them, although they're worried about the pollution that might be associated with eelgrass beds today. But Severin Suzuki, who many of you know, is David's daughter, who did her master's with us at UVic, and she studied under Kwa'ksi Stala in what we call Adams School. And so she learned about harvesting the eelgrass, and they do it with a long pole called a kilbayu, that means twisting, a twisting pole, and it's made of hemlock, a long, thin, old pole of hemlock that you find in the deep shaded woods, and it has a curved top as hemlock does. And so when you're out in the boat, you go out in low tide, and you put the pole in the water at an angle and you twist it like you would spaghetti on the end of a fork with a twist on it. If the fork is straight, you're not going to get much spaghetti, but if you have a slight curve on it, it twists up and you can get a fork full of spaghetti. And the eelgrass is the same. So they go out and twist it and pull up a clump of the eelgrass with the rhizomes and the leaves. And then they carefully would take the 4 most tender, youngest nodes of the rhizome, which is kind of a white orangey color, and they strip off all the leaves except the most tender one at the top, and then they curl it around the rhizome, dip it in grease and eat it fresh. And they used to have feasts of this where the chiefs would sit down with a pile of eelgrass and they'd prepare it right there and dip it in the grease and eat it. And it was a big occasion. And so the way that it was harvested in this clumps, Severn did experiments with harvesting eelgrass in this patchy, partial disturbance kind of regime. And she found that when the eelgrass is thinned out like that, the patches thin out, the shoots from the adjacent plants grow much faster and they're more tender. And so geese and brant also rely on eelgrass, and people may have learned about eating it from the geese and brant. But the kind of harvesting that they do and the patchiness, the eelgrass won't get root bound in the same way that iris is in your garden. If you don't thin them out, they get root bound and they won't even flower. And eelgrass is the same way, it can get root bound like that. So when you're harvesting it in that kind of patchy way, you're actually increasing its productivity and its growth.
Just fascinating. Fascinating. Thank you for asking that, Joyce. Now, are you going to go out and harvest some, Joyce? Yeah.
And
How that goes.
I think the month of May is about the right time for harvesting
there.
eelgrass.
You put that on your calendar,
April
girl.
and May.
I want to hear how that goes, Joyce. Save me some too. Judy McKinley is asking, how do you eat clover root?
Oh gosh, I wish I have some growing in a pot in a long planter out on my porch. I wish I had time to show you, but you harvest it in the fall when the leaves have died down, and they grow in these estuarine gardens, tidal marsh gardens especially. So in the fall, when the leaves start to turn yellow, you dig them up and they're long and skinny. Sometimes they're called Indian spaghetti. In fact, there's an article written by Grant Thomas Edwards called Indian Spaghetti about this plant, published in the Beaver some years ago. So they're long, they look like spaghetti, but they taste more like bean sprouts. So you get the long rhizomes and you bundle them together in bundles of, maybe 2 dozen together, tie them with a special little knot. So, the women would cook them all together in a cooking pit. So they tied them with their own special knots so they could distinguish whose was whose when they took them out. And so you can steam them, but the best way to cook them is bundled and put into this cooking pit, which had surrounded by salal branches and sword fern, and then layers of clover and silverweed bundled roots. And at the top, or at the very bottom, the Camas bulbs, because they take the longest to cook. So that's a whole nother story, though. I could go on and on about pit cooking.
And none of it is open a package, pop it in boiling water for a minute, turn off the heat, let it sit and eat it. It's always a little bit more involved, right?
It always is, yeah.
Listen, there are so many more questions and comments, Dr. Turner, but we have come up to our hour. It's almost 5 o'clock. Thank you, especially to Andrea Gunner, who is from Armstrong and asking, specifically interested on behalf of the Indigenous peoples in her community about food security issues in their communities. So maybe I can just connect the two of you somehow.
Yeah.
It sounds like that could be an involved conversation. Thank you so much, Nancy. This has just been magical and delightful. It always is. We have had so many fabulous comments. You can see them yourself in the chat box. Everybody you've been listening to and watching and being with each other on Gabbing About Gardening. We're a gathering of gardeners who refuse to let anything get us down. We like to see each other. We like to gab about gardening. We are weekly, coming at you every Monday at 3:30 on Zoom. we give freely, and we greatly appreciate any donations that you would like to share with us. And tomorrow is our first Gabbing About Gardening radio show on Cortez Radio. So you can check that out at 11:30 tomorrow. We're going to be talking about a variety of things, including composting, composting wood instead of burning it. Go figure. That's an idea whose time has come. I always like to have our guest teachers give us their parting blessing and words of advice. Nancy, would you share something with us as we all say bye-bye?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Lou and Lee and all of you. It's been such a pleasure, even though we can't all be together in the same space. We're here and together in virtual space with this commonality of love of plants and appreciation of the environment and of nature and growing things. It's so uplifting for me. It gives me energy to think about all of you out there and the good work that you're doing. And so if we don't ever get to meet face to face, I think we can all just go on knowing and enjoying the idea that we share, we're all on this one big circle of people who love the same things. And we're all making a difference in the world, I think, just by the work that we do. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. We so look forward to your being with us again. Thank you, Nancy. And we'll see everyone same time, same place next Monday, 3:30. Now go out there and get dirty, everybody. It's a beautiful day, still lots of sunshine. Happy gardening.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Delight, Nancy. I really can't tell you how much it's meant to all of us to have you share your knowledge, your stories, your delightful stories.
Thanks so much, Lou. Okay.
We'll
Bye-bye.
talk soon. Bye-bye now.